The galaxy knows the warp as an ocean of nightmares. It is a sea of chaos, swirling with madness, shaped by the fears and desires of every mortal who has ever lived. Ships sail its tides with faith as their compass, guided by the Emperor's light. But sometimes the warp does not simply stir, it ruptures. On the edge of Imperial charts, in a system insignificant to the Imperium's vast empire, the sky splits. It is no ordinary storm. It does not roll in slowly, with flickers of lightning or whispering echoes across astropathic channels. This tear bursts open like a wound carved into the very skin of reality. The void screams. Vox operators clutch their heads as visions of endless fire sear across their minds. Pilots report instruments spinning wildly. A bright fissure, jagged and raw, stretches across the void. It burns with colors no mortal tongue can name, searing the eyes of all who gaze too long. From the heart of this wound, demons claw their way into existence. Winged horrors shriek, their forms boiling in and out of shape. Imperial forces nearby respond with trained panic. Fleets scramble to lock firing solutions, psychers cry out in frantic warning, and commanders bark orders to ready defenses. To them, this is another incursion, another day of holding back hell with faith, fire, and unyielding steel. But then, amidst the cacophony, a figure steps forward. It is not like the demons that preceded him. His form is solid, unchanging, grounded in reality rather than the warp's lies. A single armored warrior emerges from the rift, carrying no banners, issuing no war cry. He says nothing at all. The void falls silent around him, as if reality itself recoils from his presence. The Doomslayer has arrived. His green armor is scarred by battles uncountable, each dent and burn a testament to wars beyond the scope of Imperial records. Weapons hang at his side, heavy with brutal purpose. Tools designed not for intimidation, but for annihilation. His visor glows faintly, reflecting no emotion, no hesitation, no mercy. Around him, demons falter. Their screeches die into whimpers. To them, this figure is not prey, not rival, but predator. They recognize him. Their howls turn to cries of terror, for they know the one truth etched into the core of their existence. This is the Slayer of Hell. Imperial officers watching from distant ships are bewildered. Reports clash, uncertain whether he is demon, angel, or something worse. Some whisper he is a champion of Khorne, born of bloodlust itself. Others believe he is a tool of the Emperor, sent to cleanse the warp. None understand that he is neither. He answers to no god, no throne, no creed. He is only fury given form. The rift behind him twists violently before collapsing, as though reality itself refuses to sustain his passage. What remains is silence, a silence more terrifying than the shrieking void. The Slayer does not pause to explain. He does not attempt to communicate. He begins to move, his steps heavy, deliberate, unstoppable. Every system he passes through destabilizes. Astropaths convulse, whispering of green fire cutting through the warp. Imperial seers cry out, unable to define his presence. Even chaos recoils. This is no ordinary incursion. It is an event. A new legend has entered the galaxy, and none yet know what it means. For the Imperium, it is an omen of doom. For demons, it is the return of terror long banished. For the Slayer, it is merely another battlefield, and somewhere, across the infinite tides of the warp, even the gods themselves turn their gaze to this lone warrior, uncertain whether his arrival heralds their greatest triumph or their ultimate annihilation. The comet's descent tore across the night sky, a streak of fire trailing through the void until it slammed into the crust of a forgotten Imperial world. The impact shook cities hundreds of kilometers away, glass shattering in hablocks as alarms blared. To the guardsmen stationed in the wastes nearby, there was no meteor. It was an omen. Dust and flame roared upward in a column, silhouetting a single armored figure rising from the crater. His form was unmistakable, neither demon nor man, but something carved from violence itself. The Doomslayer stood, the ground cracking beneath his boots, his visor reflecting the fires around him. Panic overtook the defenders. "Demon Prince!" someone shouted, though no wings, no horns, no shifting flesh marked his form. Still, fear drove them to act. Barrages of las fire streaked across the field, tracing lines of red against the smoke. Tanks rumbled forward, their cannons belching shells into the crater. The Slayer did not flinch. He moved with terrifying precision. his super shotgun erupting with thunder that tore through armored squads as though they were parchment. Chains tore from his wrist-mounted blade, dragging a screaming soldier into the dirt before ending him in a spray of blood. When a tank fired point-blank, the blast engulfed him in flame and rubble, but as the dust cleared, he emerged unbroken. With bare hands he ripped through steel plating, hauling the crew from its shattered frame before crushing them without hesitation. The guardsmen broke ranks. Some screamed prayers to the Emperor, others fled blindly into the wastes, but none held their ground for long. Against chaos, men of the guard knew their weapons had meaning. Against this warrior, their courage dissolved into ash. The battlefield became a vision of carnage. Limbs littered the ground, wrecked machines smoldered, and the silence between shotgun blasts was filled only with the rattling of lasguns in trembling hands. The slayer did not speak, did not taunt. He simply advanced, every strike deliberate, every kill absolute. There was no pause, no hesitation, no mercy. Survivors who crawled from the wreckage would later claim they had seen a god, not the Emperor, not a demon, but something older and angrier than either. One described his visor as the eye of death itself. Another swore the demons in the warp screamed louder than the dying men on the battlefield. As the smoke settled, Vox units crackled with frantic reports. Officers screamed for reinforcements, their words stumbling between fear and disbelief. Inquisitors listening across the sector marked the anomaly, already debating whether this was a new threat of chaos, or perhaps a weapon that could be bent to their cause. Above the wreckage, the Slayer stood alone. Corpses lay scattered in his wake, vehicles broken like toys, banners of the Imperium torn and burning. He offered no words of conquest, no declaration of intent. His silence was the loudest message of all. He was not an ally, not an enemy, not a servant. He was war itself. The myth began here, in the ashes of one world. A whisper passed from guardsmen who survived the massacre to commissars who did not believe them, from Vox operators to astrobaths, from desperate commanders to the high lords of terror themselves. A new war god walks among men, and he does not kneel. The galaxy has always been bound together not by unity but by whispers. From the smallest outpost to the heart of terror, news travels as fragments, broken signals, distorted transmissions, astropathic screams bleeding across the warp. When the Doomslayer descended, the first ripples were disbelief. But disbelief gave way to fear, and fear spreads faster than light. Reports flowed in from shattered worlds. Survivors spoke of a figure clad in green who tore through Imperial steel as though it were parchment, who killed without hesitation and who did not speak. Vox operators stammered the same fragmented words again and again. Unstoppable, unholy, unbound. No one knew what to call him, but all agreed on one fact: he could not be human. Astropaths tried to send warnings through the warp, and in doing so condemned themselves. Visions overwhelmed them. An armored giant drenched in ichor, his presence dragging the light from the astronomy can. They screamed until their eyes burned away, clawing their own faces apart in futile attempts to escape what they had seen. Even aboard the black ships, where psychers were shackled and monitored, echoes of the same nightmare rippled through the holds. Thousands of psychic prisoners wept at once, muttering of a god that walked in silence. Inquisitors listening to these fragmented transmissions reacted with suspicion and fear. Some dismissed it as a new chaos ploy, a demon lord sent to shake humanity's faith. Others whispered of opportunity. What if this being could be harnessed, directed toward the Imperium's enemies? But beneath the calculated words of the Inquisition lay a deeper truth. None of them truly believed they could control a force that already shattered armies and defied comprehension. The ecclesiarchy reacted with even more fervor. Priests declared this intruder a heresy given flesh, an abomination that mocked the Emperor's divinity. Yet, in the dark corners of terror, there were others, whispering voices in cloisters, hidden sects, that wondered aloud if he was not heresy, but revelation. A god of war, walking without scripture or prayer, who killed gods themselves. The high lords of terror debated with venomous urgency. Their council, already fractured by politics, broke further under the strain. Was he a weapon? A threat? An omen of the Emperor's wrath? Arguments turned to shouts, shouts to threats, and more than one lord fell dead in the weeks that followed, murder silenced beneath the veil of political necessity. Even terror, the cradle of humanity, shook with uncertainty. And in the deepest chamber of the imperial palace, a stir unlike any in 10 millennia trembled. The Emperor, bound to his golden throne, flickered faintly with awareness. His will brushed against the warp, sensing something outside its order. He had seen Horus, he had seen the Chaos Gods, he had seen the tides of the warp itself. But this was not the same. This was no demon, no sun, no champion of corruption. This was something else, something his empire was not prepared to face. The Doomslayer's name was not known, yet his legend had already taken root. Across the Imperium he was called many things: the Green Reaper, the Silent War God, the Demon Hunter. Titles mattered little. What mattered was the fear that carried them, the unease etched into every retelling. And so the whispers reached the throne itself. The Imperium, vast and unyielding, had weathered heresies, invasions, and the horrors of the warp. But never before had it faced a storm born outside of its laws, outside of its gods, outside of its faith. The Slayer's shadow stretched across the stars, and though his path was only beginning, the galaxy already trembled. The Imperium had seen this pattern before. A lone figure rises, faith is shaken, and whispers spread like fire across the stars. 10,000 years ago, it was Horus. Now, it was something nameless. The Inquisition knew better than to wait. Delay breeds heresy, and heresy spreads like plague. Across the galaxy, inquisitorial orders stirred. Each faction offered its own verdict. The Ordo Malleus declared the intruder a demon prince too dangerous to ignore. The Ordo Heroticus branded him the seed of rebellion, a false god inspiring cults. The Ordo Xenos, ever wary, speculated that he was a weapon from beyond the galaxy. None could agree on what he was, only that he must be destroyed. Kill teams were dispatched. Assassins from the Officio Assassinorum moved like shadows, slipping into war zones where the Slayer had been sighted. Vindicare snipers took positions, their rounds blessed to pierce the hearts of traitor kings. Eversa berserkers were unleashed, frothing with chemical rage, meant to kill anything they touched. Deathwatch squads of space marines joined the hunt, each carrying relic weapons designed to annihilate foes of humanity. And still, psychers were sent to probe his mind, to divine what manner of creature he was. They found nothing but ruin. The first strike came on a world already scarred by the Slayer's fury. And Eversa, fueled by enough chemrage to slaughter an entire battalion, launched himself at the figure in green. For mere seconds the battle raged, shrieks, blades, the hiss of toxins, until silence returned. The assassin's broken body was hurled into the dirt, his skull crushed in the Slayer's gauntlet. Vindicare bullets followed, their trajectory flawless, their penetration designed to kill at distances unimaginable. Each one struck true. Each one flattened against his armor as though it were striking a mountain. The Slayer turned, his gaze locking on the sniper's nest miles away. He fired once. The blast reduced the Vindicare to ash before he could reload. Deathwatch Marines were next. Veterans of 100 Xenos wars, they charged with bolters roaring and chainswords shrieking. The Slayer answered with thunderous fire and devastating precision. One by one, post-human warriors fell, their transhuman resilience meaningless before raw, unrelenting fury. What they thought was a hunt became a massacre. And then came the Psychers. They reached for his mind, expecting a storm of corruption or whispers of chaos. What they touched instead was a void deeper than the warp itself. No voice spoke to them, no thread of faith or corruption bound him. There was only rage, endless silent burning like the core of a dying star. Psychers screamed as their eyes burst, their bodies convulsing until blood spilled from every orifice. They died babbling of an abyss that even demons feared to enter. Across the galaxy, inquisitorial reports accumulated, each one more desperate than the last. The data was chilling. He could not be reasoned with, could not be stopped by stealth, precision, or faith. Every strategy collapsed into the same result: slaughter. What frightened the Inquisition most was not just his power, but his indifference. He spoke no oaths, made no declarations, sought no throne. He killed with the inevitability of a storm, advancing always toward the heart of the Imperium without acknowledging those who resisted him. The High Lords demanded explanations. The Inquisition offered none. They had no name, no species, no origin. They had only fragmented descriptions, carried in blood and fire, an armored giant, silent, immune to fear, unbroken by faith. The conclusion was undeniable. This was no rebellion, no cult leader, no demon lord. This was something worse. And yet, even as inquisitorial fleets fell back and kill teams were annihilated, the Slayer pressed forward. His silence became legend. His fury became a prophecy. He could not be killed, contained, or even understood. The Inquisition's hunt ended not with victory, but with the chilling realization that their most feared weapons had failed. Their sacred assassins lay in ruins, their psychers dead in madness, their astartes broken. The Imperium asked its most desperate question, one it had not dared to ask in 10,000 years. If the Inquisition cannot stop him, who can? The astartes had always been the Imperium's hammer, warriors engineered beyond mortal limits, sculpted to be demigods of war. Entire civilizations trembled at their approach. In the darkest hours of the Imperium, when all else faltered, the Adeptus Astartes stood unbroken. Against a lone warrior, they felt no fear. Against a legend, they knew no hesitation. Multiple chapters answered the call. From the Ultramarines came stoic veterans, blue ceramite gleaming beneath banners of duty. From the Black Templars, zealots hungry for holy war. Even the Space Wolves, clad in pelts and fangs, sought to prove themselves against this new foe. Together they formed a strike force meant to crush any enemy, human or demon alike. Their thunderhawks descended in fire, cutting through the smoke-filled skies of a ruined world where the Slayer's path of destruction had already left cities in ash. Thousands of eyes watched from the shadows, guardsmen, cultists, and survivors alike. All bore witness to a confrontation spoken of for generations, the might of the emperors chosen against the silent predator from beyond. The Astartes advanced with discipline. Bolters barked thunder, each round the size of a man's fist, explosive cores shredding through tanks and fortifications with ease. Chanswords revved, their jagged teeth hungry for blood. Terminators lumbered forward like walking fortresses, stormbolters blazing. And the Slayer moved. His super shotgun roared, turning one Marine into ruin before he could even raise a shield. With a speed that defied comprehension, he closed the gap, tearing through ceramite as though it were cloth. A chainsword swung, its teeth screaming, but the Slayer caught it in one hand and snapped it in half. His gauntleted fist crushed the helm of its wielder, snapping spine and skull in one merciless blow. The battlefield descended into chaos. Bolter rounds struck him in volleys, detonating against his armor. Where others would be shredded, he endured, his relentless march never faltering. The Slayer's arsenal turned the Astartes' pride into horror, plasma tearing through Terminator armor, the crucible blade cutting through shield walls in a single arc. One by one, demigods fell, their sacred oaths meaningless against the embodiment of unending rage. But the true terror came not from his weapons, but from his silence. The Astartes had faced heretics who spat curses, demons who howled blasphemies, even Xenos who roared in defiance. But this warrior offered nothing. No words, no cries, no creed. His silence pressed heavier on their hearts than any battle roar. Among them was a librarian, a psycho warrior attuned to the warp. He reached out with his mind to read the intruder's essence, to see if this was demon, angel, or trick. What he found instead drove him to his knees. He did not touch the warp. He touched something deeper, a predator older than gods, a void that consumed corruption and faith alike. The librarian's scream echoed through the vox. He is not of the warp. He hunts it. Moments later, his skull was split in two. The slaughter was swift. What began as confidence devolved into disbelief, then into dread. The Black Templars prayed as they died. The Space Wolves howled with defiance until their howls were silenced. The Ultramarines fought with discipline until their lines shattered. Their deaths were not meaningless. Their fury slowed him. Their courage bought moments, but none could halt his march. When the smoke cleared, only corpses remained. Their banners lay in tatters, relics broken, armor shattered. The battlefield, once a monument to imperial pride, became a graveyard of gods brought low. Survivors among the guard who had witnessed it whispered in terror, if the Astartes could fall, then what hope was left for mankind? And in that silence, the truth spread like wildfire. This was no anomaly. This was no demon prince. This was a force that the Emperor himself would have to face. The Slayer's legend grew with every death, and the Imperium trembled. The astronomy can had burned bright for 10,000 years. A psychic flame, fueled by the Emperor's will, pierced the warp and guided humanity's ships like a star in eternal darkness. Entire fleets depended on its light. Entire worlds lived by its constancy. Even during the Horus Heresy, even in the galaxy's darkest hour, the astronomy can had not faltered. But now, it flickered. At first, it was subtle. Navigators reported turbulence in their visions, shadows where there should have been certainty. They strained their third eyes until blood poured from their sockets, unable to make sense of the shifting beacon. Some captains dismissed it as a momentary storm. But as days passed, doubt became dread. The light of the Emperor, the one constant of the Imperium, was wavering. On pilgrimage routes, millions of faithful dropped to their knees in terror. Their prayers rose louder, desperate hymns demanding reassurance. Shrines overflowed with candles, their wax melting faster than hands could replace them. Priests whipped congregations into frenzy, declaring that louder prayer would strengthen the throne. Yet no matter how many voices lifted into the void, the flame continued to gutter. Psychers were the first to break. Across the galaxy, thousands screamed at once, their visions filled with the image of a green-armored warrior drenched in demon blood. They convulsed until their bones snapped, their screams echoing through astropathic choirs before ending in silence. To them, the figure was not chaos, nor salvation, but an intruder who bent the warp itself by his mere presence. Even the black ships, carrying their cargo of the damned, reported waves of madness coursing through their holds. And in the immaterium, the chaos gods laughed. Khorne bellowed with glee at the endless slaughter, even as unease gnawed his fury. Tizinte whispered 1,000 schemes, only to admit none accounted for the Slayer's existence. Nurgle chuckled at the rot of faith, though even his plagues recoiled from this void of corruption. Slaanesh shivered with both hunger and fear, tasting no vice in him, no weakness to exploit. They reveled in the collapse of the Astronomicon, but their laughter was edged with dread. For the Doom Slayer was not their ally, he was their hunter. On Terra, the truth could no longer be ignored. The custodians, silent for millennia, gathered in uneasy council. Inquisitors brought reports written in trembling script. Assassins annihilated, Astartes broken, Psychers driven mad. The High Lords screamed at one another in desperation, their voices rising above the echoes of riots outside the palace walls. If the Astronomicon fell, the Imperium itself would crumble. And in the deepest chamber of the palace, the Golden Throne shuddered. The Emperor, bound and silent for 10,000 years, stirred faintly. His light, once a blazing sun, dimmed and flared as though something pressed against his will. He reached through the warp and sensed it clearly, the intruder who had already shattered armies and burned worlds. But this was no sun, no champion of chaos, no rival craving power. This was a being without allegiance, without faith, without desire for dominion. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor felt something close to uncertainty. The Doomslayer could not be tempted, swayed, or bargained with. He was not a rebellion to be crushed, nor a demon to be banished. He was inevitable, and so the galaxy trembled. The Astronomicon faltered again, flickering like a dying flame. Fleets were stranded, billions wept, and the warp grew wilder. Pilgrims cried out in despair, believing their god had abandoned them. Priests bled from their throats as they screamed defiance against inevitability. Yet no hymn could restore the light, for the disturbance was not faithless men, it was the Slayer. The coming clash was inevitable. The unstoppable had entered the galaxy, and the immovable sat upon his throne. One would break, and when Terra trembled, the galaxy would follow. The Imperium had always been held together not by mercy, nor by truth, but by faith. Cathedrals rose taller than mountains, their spires piercing the polluted skies of hive worlds. Pilgrimages stretched for centuries, millions of souls crossing wastelands to glimpse a relic or touch the stone of a shrine. Every battle, every death, every sacrifice was framed as devotion to the Emperor's divine will. Faith was the glue of an empire too vast to govern. And then the Slayer came. On the first shrine world he touched, the bells of worship rang in alarm as his boots cracked the marble steps of the Grand Basilica. Priests lifted their relics high, voices hoarse with hymns. The faithful cried out, desperate to drown the silence of the intruder. They believed their god would protect them, as he always had. They were wrong. The Slayer's shotgun thundered, and the air filled with shattered glass and blood. Sacred statues toppled as if they were nothing but brittle idols. Altars split beneath his fists. The screams of priests became indistinguishable from the shrieks of demons as both fell beneath his unrelenting fury. He did not mock their faith. He did not desecrate their symbols with words. He simply destroyed them, indifferent and absolute. Word spread faster than fire. Vox transmissions carried tales of his destruction, each report more desperate than the last. He spares no priest. one survivor whispered. "He spares no shrine," cried another. Pilgrims fled in panic, trampling each other in their attempts to escape holy grounds. Once harmonious hymns twisted into riots, their choruses replaced with the cries of the starving and the betrayed. The Adeptus Ministorum scrambled to contain the tide. From pulpits, cardinals roared that the slayer was a test, a punishment sent to refine the faithful. Inquisitors burned thousands of suspected heretics in mass purges, insisting that weakness of spirit was to blame for his victories. Yet their words faltered. The faithful had seen too much. He was not chaos. He whispered no temptation, offered no forbidden gifts, made no bargains. He demanded no worship, no submission, no surrender. The Imperium had built itself upon the duality of faith and heresy, but here was something that fit neither. To believers, this was far worse than a demon prince. Demons at least could be named, resisted, and purged. The slayer was nameless, faithless, inevitable. On other worlds, psychers collapsed in agony as they attempted to read the warp for answers. Visions consumed them, visions of green light cutting through oceans of demons. A single figure who could not be touched, who could not be corrupted, who carried no tether to the warp. Many burned alive from the strain. Others clawed their eyes out, shrieking of a silence so loud it drowned their thoughts. As the slayer advanced, cathedrals became ruins, and the pillars of faith crumbled alongside them. The Adeptus Sororitas fought with burning fury, chanting litanies as their flamers roared. They held for minutes, sometimes hours, but never more. Their relics blackened, their hymns silenced, their banners trampled under his boots. Even their faith, the strongest flame the Imperium could muster, failed to sway him. The cracks spread outward. On Terra itself, pilgrims heard the rumors, their chants faltering in the great plazas. If shrines could be toppled, if priests could be silenced, if saints could be burned, then what truly sustained the Imperium? Faith had always been its foundation. Now that foundation was rotting before their eyes. Fear bred rebellion. Pilgrimages turned to riots. Riots became massacres. The Ministorum ordered purges, hoping to burn fear out of existence, but each pyre only deepened despair. The Imperium's great lie, that faith could protect against anything, had been shattered by a figure who did not care about faith at all. The slayer moved on, leaving only rubble behind. He did not pause to gaze upon the ruins he created, did not linger to savor victory. He simply advanced unstoppable, silent, inevitable. And with every step, the Imperium's belief in itself withered further. For the first time in 10,000 years, the unthinkable question was whispered in cloisters and alleys alike. If faith cannot protect us, what can? Terra had always been the fortress of mankind, the cradle of humanity, the seat of the Emperor, the world upon which the galaxy's fate had been decided 10,000 years before. Its walls had withstood heresy, Xeno's invasions, and endless centuries of decay. Yet now, for the first time since Horus had stormed its gates, Terra prepared itself for annihilation. The High Lords gave their orders with trembling hands. The Astra Militarum was summoned in numbers that defied imagination. Millions of guardsmen marched through choking streets, filling trenches carved into scorched ground. They carried lasguns and faith, though both shook in their grasp. Commissars barked oaths of loyalty, bolstering morale through threats of summary execution. The people of Terra, already hardened by millennia of misery, looked on in silence. None cheered. None believed. Titans, ancient god machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, stalked through ruined cityscapes, their footfalls shattered already cracked streets, their banners whipping in the storm winds. Each was a relic of the Great Crusade, awakened from hibernation for this singular moment. Their volcano cannons and plasma annihilators glowed with destructive power, aimed skyward in grim defiance. Yet even their crews, bound in sacred machine prayers, felt doubt coil in their iron hearts. The Astartes mustered what remained of their honor. Broken fragments of chapters, survivors from doomed crusades, and battered veterans gathered as the last bulwark of the palace. They lined the walls and bastions, bolters held tight, their voices reciting litanies of hate. They had fallen once before, humiliated at the Slayer's hands, but still Ray came. Pride demanded nothing less. If Terra burned, it would burn with them standing at its gates. From the forges of Mars and the vaults beneath the palace, the Adeptus Mechanicus dragged forth weapons long forbidden. War machines entombed since the dark age of technology were awakened, their spirits coaxed to life with rituals that blended science and sorcery. War engines roared, their cores unstable, their machine spirits snarling in rebellion. Tech priests intoned binary hymns louder than their doubts, masking fear beneath ritual precision. These were not weapons meant to defend, they were sacrifices unleashed because the Imperium had no other choice. Above, the skies bristled with fortifications. Orbital defense platforms hummed with energy, void shields crackled, and fleets formed a bulwark around the cradle of mankind. Battleships the size of continents floated in disciplined formations, their guns angled toward the void where the Slayer's approach was foretold. Admirals barked orders through gritted teeth, their crews scrambling to ready weapons older than their lineages. And still, the astropaths screamed. Their cries carried across the warp, fractured and broken. He is coming. That was all they could say, their voices unspooling into madness as the Slayer's shadow darkened the void. No fleet could stop him. No fortress had slowed him. He advanced, unstoppable, inexorable. And yet terror prepared, because ritual demanded it, because tradition commanded it, because to do anything less was unthinkable. Every wall was braced, every gun was loaded. Every man, woman and child was told that their sacrifice would matter. The Emperor's chosen world would not surrender, not kneel, not die quietly. The Imperium, for all its cracks and failures, still knew one truth. Terror was humanity's heart, and its defenders would bleed until the last drop was spilled. But commanders trembled in private. Admirals whispered in silent chambers. Inquisitors sharpened their blades for one another, already preparing for blame when failure came. They had seen the reports. They had heard the screams of psychers and the cries of survivors. Nothing had slowed him before. Armies that could conquer star systems had fallen like wheat before the scythe. What hope did terror truly have? Still, preparations continued. The banners of the Imperium were raised one final time, stretching from the palace walls to the void shields in orbit. In every hymn, every ritual, every act of fortification, there was defiance. They knew they would not win, but they would not go quietly. And above them, across the void, a shadow drew nearer. The warp churned like an ocean in a storm. Waves of unreality rose and crashed against one another, their tides pulling demons screaming into rifts they could not escape. Even the most ancient entities of the Immaterium, accustomed to eternity's horrors, recoiled. A presence was moving through the void, not subtle, not hidden, but burning, tearing a direct path across reality as though the warp itself were his prey. Demons who would normally swarm battlefields fled into shadows, clawing at the fabric of their own dimension to escape. For them, the Doomslayer was no rumor, no myth. He was terror incarnate, the only hunter who had ever carved through their kind without falter. His coming was not a battle cry, but a silence that deafened even gods. And the gods themselves stirred. Khorne roared in glee and fury, sensing rivers of blood yet knowing the Slayer's wrath was not his to command. Tezinche whispered schemes that unraveled the moment they touched this anomaly. Nurgle giggled at decay, but his plagues wilted at the thought of being torn apart without hesitation. Slaanesh quivered, hungering for his essence yet recoiling at the void where no corruption dwelled. They exulted, yes, but their laughter was edged with unease. This was their greatest feast, but one that might devour them in turn. Across the material galaxy, Imperial fleets mobilized. Armadas stationed along the Slayer's path hurled themselves into hopeless resistance. Battleships unleashed salvos that could obliterate continents. Escorts darted through void like schools of predatory fish, releasing volleys of torpedoes. The void filled with fire and steel, humanity throwing everything it had to stop the green-clad figure within the storm. And yet, nothing slowed him. Every fleet that engaged was shattered, reduced to drifting hulks bleeding atmosphere and flame. Survivors transmitted warnings before their signals fell silent. He cannot be stopped. Astropaths wailed in agony as his shadow passed across the warp, their visions filled with his relentless advance. To mortal eyes, his ship appeared not as mere steel, but as omen. It burned through the void like a comet, a streak of emerald fire crossing the night. Entire populations gathered on balconies, rooftops, and streets to stare at the streak cutting across their skies. Some cried out prayers to the Emperor, begging for deliverance. Others fell into silence, as if words themselves were useless before the inevitability that approached. On Terra, the skies darkened. Vox networks carried only static, broken by screams of astropaths burning out their souls. Billions felt a weight pressing upon their hearts, the collective intuition of a species staring at extinction. Mothers clutched their children. Priests whipped congregations into madness, shrieking that this was the final trial. Riots broke out in the underhives, their chaos spilling upward toward the surface. And in the imperial palace, the custodians prepared. Clad in oromite, each one a paragon of martial perfection, they stood in silence along the marble halls. Their faces betrayed nothing, but even they felt the weight of inevitability. They had defended their emperor for 10,000 years. Now they would stand once more, though whether it would matter against what was coming, none could say. The slayer drew nearer. His silence thundered louder than any war horn, louder than the desperate cries of billions. Every world he left behind was a drumbeat in the march toward terror. Ruin, fire, silence. His footsteps echoed not in air, but in destiny itself, carrying annihilation forward with no hesitation, no pause. Humanity held its breath. The Emperor's throne, untouchable for millennia, would soon be tested by a storm it had never prepared for. And when the green comet finally struck Terra, the galaxy itself would tremble. The siege of the Golden Throne was about to begin. The first blow against Terra was not a weapon, but the sky itself. A comet of fire ripped through orbit, tearing apart defense platforms as though they were paper lanterns. Massive void stations, some the size of cities, fired in desperation, their batteries unleashing storms of plasma and macro shells. They had been designed to resist fleets, to endure the sieges of traitor legions. Against the Doomslayer, they lasted only minutes. His ship tore through void shields, splintered armor, and left the once mighty bulwarks tumbling silently into the void. Admirals screamed for reinforcements. Crewmen fired until their weapons overheated and their lungs burst from smoke. Nothing slowed the descent. When his vessel pierced the last ring of orbital defenses, it burned like a second sun, a green flame falling into history. The impact shook the planet. Terra's crust convulsed as the Slayer struck ground. Towers toppled in hive cities, oceans rippled with tsunamis, and entire districts crumbled under the shockwave. For billions, it felt as though the world itself had cried out in agony. Dust and fire rose into the stratosphere, painting the sky red. To the people of Terra, it was as if the heresy had returned, but this time, no fleet, no legion, no Primarch led the charge. Only one figure. Imperial Guard regiments, the countless soldiers of the Astra Militarum, opened fire in waves. Trenches lit up with glass fire, artillery roared, and tanks unleashed barrages that split the earth. For a moment, the battlefield became a storm of light and fury. But the storm was not theirs. The Slayer strode through fire as if it were mist. Tanks were overturned by his fists, their crews torn out like vermin from nests. Gun lines melted before his advance, their volleys cutting trenches into dust but leaving his armor unscarred. Entire platoons vanished in thunderous bursts of shotgun fire or were shredded beneath his blade. Commissars screamed orders of faith, only to be silenced mid-sentence by the reality of his fury. The custodians, watching from the palace, hesitated for the first time in millennia. These were not mortals breaking before a god, nor demons retreating before the Emperor's light. This was something else entirely, something that neither faith nor discipline could name. Titans were unleashed. Towering machines of godlike scale strode forward, their cannons tearing city blocks into rubble. War horns blared, shaking the earth as the Imperium's greatest weapons moved to confront a single man. They fired. The world convulsed beneath the volley. And still he came. One Titan fell with its leg sheared clean by a blow no mortal could deliver. Another toppled backward, its reactor detonating in a sunburst that vaporized thousands. The Slayer strode through the inferno, untouched, advancing ever closer to the palace. Above the planet, fleets still fought in futility. Battleships fired until their magazines ran dry, torpedoes screamed through the void, and lance strikes scarred the planet's atmosphere. Each volley ended the same way. Silence. Ships broke apart one after another, tumbling in flames toward the surface, their deaths adding to the apocalyptic vision. Terror burned in the sky as much as on the ground. Billions watched. From hive towers, from cathedrals, from the ruins of shrines, they stared at the figure who carved through their armies. For generations they had been taught that terror was eternal, that its walls could never fall, that the emperors will alone safeguarded their world. Now those promises are cracked with every step of the Slayer. Panic erupted across the hives. Pilgrims screamed in despair, tearing their robes and smashing icons. Riots spread through the underhives, fires consuming what war had not already destroyed. Priests bellowed prayers until their throats split, declaring this was the emperor's final test. Few listened. The custodians, paragons of loyalty, exchanged grim glances. Even their hearts wavered as they prepared for the inevitable. They had defended the palace against traitor legions, demonic incursions, and 1,000 hidden threats. But never this. Never him. The Slayer stood amidst the ruin, smoke and flame rising like a crown around him. He did not pause to look at the destruction, did not savor the chaos. He advanced as he always had, without hesitation, without mercy, without end. Terror, cradle of humanity, had become a war-torn ruin, and the storm was only beginning. The golden gate of the imperial palace had never fallen. Its walls had defied traitor legions, demonic hordes, and every shadow that had dared threaten terror. Guarding it stood the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's chosen warriors crafted not as soldiers but as living extensions of his will. Each was a legend in flesh, their strength eclipsing that of space marines, their loyalty unbreakable, their skill beyond human measure. For 10,000 years they had waited, unyielding, vigilant, eternal. And now their moment had come. Clad in gleaming oromite, they formed ranks along the marble causeways before the gate. Guardian spears gleamed with lethal brilliance, storm shields locked in place, their armor reflecting the fire of a burning terror. To mortals, they were gods of war, statues carved from the Emperor's own light. To themselves, they were brothers, ready to die where they stood. The Doom Slayer approached. He did not march with an army. He did not ride a war machine. He walked alone, his boots leaving scorched cracks in the ground. The silence of his approach was louder than a war horn, his presence heavier than the thunder of titans. The custodians had trained to meet every threat imaginable, but not this. At the High Prefect's command, the custodians struck. Bolters roared, their rounds exploding like miniature suns. Hundreds of shells detonated against the Slayer's armor, the air filling with smoke and thunder. He did not stop. Blades clashed. Guardian spears struck with divine precision, capable of piercing Terminator plate like parchment. They glanced off his armor or sank shallowly before he wrenched them free. His shotgun fired, tearing golden warriors apart in bursts of gore. His blade, crimson, burning with otherworldly fury, carved through shields and bodies alike. The custodians fought without fear. Each one moved with the skill of a demigod, striking in perfect harmony, each death a sacrifice to buy seconds more. They leapt, they struck, they bled, but each fell one by one. Their perfection, sculpted over millennia, broke before something that could not be measured by reason or rule. The first custodian to fall was impaled on his own spear, torn from his hands and driven back through his armor. The second had his helm crushed between gauntleted fists, his body hurled against the marble with enough force to crack stone. The third was cleaved in half, his blood staining the golden steps he had sworn to defend. And yet they did not break. Each clash became a myth retold in the screams of mortals who watched from the walls. The Slayer killed, but he did not dishonor. Each custodian met him as warrior against warrior, their deaths echoing like the passing of legends. Their blood painted the Golden Gate red, their corpses piled upon its steps, but not one retreated. For hours the courtyard became a furnace of carnage. The Slayer advanced slowly, not because he was tired, but because their resistance demanded it. Custodians who had never tasted defeat bought each moment with their lives. Their deaths were not in vain, their sacrifice slowed inevitability, delaying the storm. But it did not stop it. At last, silence returned. The final custodian stood, armor broken, shield cracked, his spear trembling in exhausted hands. He faced the Slayer alone amidst the ruin of his brothers. With one last roar, he lunged. The strike was perfect, as flawless as the Emperor's design. It shattered against the Slayer's blade, and the golden warrior fell. The courtyard was still. The Golden Gate, symbol of the Emperor's majesty, now ran red with the blood of his chosen. The custodians, once thought eternal, lay scattered and broken. Perfection had met something beyond measure, and perfection had lost. The Slayer stood amidst the ruin, untouched, inevitable, unstoppable. He looked upon the gate not as a conqueror, not as a worshipper, but as a storm gazing upon another obstacle to break. And then, with the silence of inevitability, he advanced toward the throne. The Golden Gate lay behind him, drowned in blood and ruin. The corpses of the Emperor's finest guardians marked his path, their golden armor cracked and stained dark upon the marble. Statues toppled, relics shattered, and banners once raised in triumph now burned as embers in the choking air. The Doomslayer advanced, his silence more deafening than any roar of conquest. The palace itself, a labyrinth of sanctity and history, shook beneath his steps. Its walls, carved with the victories of the Great Crusade, trembled as though they too recognized the storm that had breached them. Servitors froze in place, their machine minds unable to process his presence. Choirs of priests fell to their knees, howling prayers that dissolved into screams when the intruder passed. Deep within the palace, psychers collapsed one after another, their minds, already strained by the dimming astronomy can, shattered as his shadow crept closer. Visions of his armored form filled their thoughts, crimson-streaked, silent, relentless. Some clawed at their eyes, others bit through their tongues, and many burst into flame as the warp recoiled from what they had touched. Every corridor he passed became a grave. Adeptus Arbites raised shields, chanting oaths of judgment, only to be torn apart in seconds. Sisters of Silence, their very presence a null against the warp, charged with blades drawn. They were skilled, faster than mortals, immune to psychic corruption. Yet against him, their silence was meaningless. He cut them down as easily as the rest, leaving their order broken upon the stones they had sworn to protect. The deeper he pressed, the more sacred the halls became. Marble pillars carved with saints cracked as bolt of fire thundered against him. The stained glass of holy chapels shattered into shards that glittered across the ground. Frescoes depicting the emperor's triumphs blackened under the fire of exploding tanks. The palace, heart of the Imperium, transformed into a war zone of smoke, blood, and ruin. And still he came. Far above, the astronomy can flickered like a candle guttering in the wind. Across the galaxy, navigators clutched their heads, screaming that terror itself was unraveling. Fleets turned adrift, pilgrims lost all bearings, and the chaos gods roared with delight. Yet even their laughter faltered, for they too knew where this storm was heading. At last, the Slayer reached the innermost gates. These were not merely walls of stone or steel, but sanctified barriers layered with wards written in languages older than memory. Custodian relics burned upon their frames, and the prayers of billions had been carved into their surface. For 10,000 years, no foe had touched these doors. He placed his hand upon them. The wards flared in defiance, light searing the air, burning against his gauntlet. For a heartbeat, the chamber shook with resistance, the voices of saints echoing in defiance. Then the light cracked. The sacred sigils fractured. The prayers crumbled into silence. With one motion, he pushed, and the gate screamed open. Inside lay the sanctum of sanctums, the throne room. Vast as a mountain lit by 1,000 burning torches, its air heavy with incense and the weight of a god's presence. At its center, seated upon the golden throne, the emperor of mankind burned with faint light. His skeletal form was both corpse and divinity, bound to his seat of power, his aura weaker now than at any time since the heresy. The Doom Slayer entered. For the first time since Horus, the emperor stirred. His light flared faintly, casting long shadows across the ruined chamber. His presence pressed against the intruder, an ocean of psychic force meant to crush any mortal into dust. But the Slayer did not bend. He did not bow. He stood silent, weapon in hand, eyes fixed upon the immortal god of man. The throne trembled. The storm had reached its end. The immovable god and the unstoppable predator now faced one another. The clash was inevitable. The galaxy held its breath. The golden throne pulsed like a dying star. Cables thick as columns fed a skeleton crowned in light, and terror's engines exhaled incense and static as the planet prayed. The palace grew quiet, like a battlefield holding its breath. The Doom Slayer stood in the doorway, a silhouette cut from war, visor glimmering against divinity. For 10 millennia, the emperor had not risen. He had guided fleets and crushed heresies from a throne both tomb and lighthouse. Now, confronted by a force beyond design, his aura gathered like a tide. Statues groaned. Gold leaf drifted from pillars. A wind of souls swept the hall. The Slayer did not move. No oath crossed his tongue. No fear colored his stance. He stood within a storm of psychic power and remained a still point. His weapons were quiet in his hands, but the room remembered every world they had undone. The Emperor rose. Light-wrapped bones and memory-forgotten victories flared. The weight of humanity's hope poured forward like sunrise. When his feet touched the steps, servitors wept oil. Custodian blood steamed where radiance touched it. His voice did not speak in words at first. It spoke in horizons. The thought pressed gently, then inexorably. Stand down. The command had broken civilizations and bent primarchs. The Slayer's reply was the click of a weapon settling into purpose. The sound rang like a knell, absolute, and the Emperor's light narrowed to a spear. Reality bunched, marble flexed, the air turned to glass. The first wave of psychic fire rolled from the throne, not a beam, but an ocean the color of remembered dawn. It erased dust, scoured blood from stone, and hurled relics into shrapnel. It met the Slayer and broke around him like surf against black rock. He leaned into it, boots biting granite, armor flaring with heat, visor an unblinking star. Across Terra, astropaths collapsed as the Astronomicon surged and dipped. In orbit, void shields rippled as if the planet shivered. On distant worlds, navigators felt a hand lift and tremble, and knew whose hand it was. The High Lords fell to their knees, some in prayer, some in calculation, all in fear. The Emperor descended the last steps, magnificence tempered to precision. A golden blade shimmered into his grasp, coalesced from faith and will, its edge singing with histories. He did not posture. He measured the way a swordsmith measures a line before the cut. The Slayer advanced to meet him, every motion efficient as a verdict. When they closed, the chamber forgot to echo. Steel met light. The sound was a bell struck at the heart of the world. Shockwaves raced along colonnades, turning stained glass into storms of knives. The first exchange mapped the war, thought against momentum, destiny against refusal. Sparks traced constellations and died. The Emperor pressed, each stroke a theorem, each step a law. Philosophies unfolded in his wake, and the air agreed. The Slayer answered with arithmetic the universe could not ignore. Force applied, angles reduced, distance murdered. He cut through conclusions with the certainty used to open 1,000 doors into hell. Psychers listening bled from the ears. Demons watching from the margins fell silent. Nothing in the warp wanted either truth to prevail, and yet both advanced. The chamber smelled of ozone and incense. The floor cracked beneath invisible weights. At last the Emperor spoke aloud. You will not unmake my species. Promise and threat, prayer and law. The Slayer's answer was forward. The super shotgun thundered like an organ. The golden blade intercepted both blasts in sparks that fell as harmless stars. The Emperor's eyes, suns caged in bone, narrowed. The duel widened, rose up the steps, crashed back down. Each impact wrote a scripture of ruin. The throne hummed, cables straining, reactor choirs chanting in panic. Outside, sirens wailed. Beneath the world, engines that had not stopped since the heresy faltered and caught again. Neither yielded. The Emperor's will was a continent. The Slayer's refusal was the ocean-eating coasts. Between them hung the future like a fragile bridge of light and smoke. Somewhere far away, a child on a pilgrim ship asked why the star had dimmed. No one answered. The second movement began. The chamber ignited. The Emperor's blade swept in an arc that wrote commandments into air, a ribbon of sunfire curling toward the intruder. The Doomslayer met it with motion that did not argue, only ended. He slid inside the radiance, the super shotgun barking once, twice, detonations blossoming against a guard of light. Marble exploded. Psychic pressure swelled, centuries of dominion condensed into a single stride. The Emperor raised a hand and the world obeyed. Gravity deepened columns bent the Slayer's boots cratered stone. He should have knelt. Instead, he drove forward, a shoulder crashing through the invisible wall as if headbutting a verdict. The golden sword descended. Sparks hissed from the Slayer's pauldron. The crucible sang awake in his grip, its red edge unfurling like a wound. Light met light, the contact birthed a shriek that rattled reliquaries and sent incense braziers skittering. They traded distances measured in heartbeats. The Emperor struck with geometry, every cut resolving a paradox, every thrust a signature of empire. The Slayer answered in brutal syllables, rip, tear, reload. He vaulted a shattered plinth. The Emperor met him mid-air, palm opening, a sunlance erupting. Shields failed, armor blackened, but the man inside advanced. Terror felt the tempo. Sea walls convulsed, pilgrims collapsed, palms pressed to stone. The Emperor reached for time itself. For an instant the hall elongated like glass being drawn. The Slayer slowed, a statue teased from momentum. Gold letters scrolled across reality, a decree to end the intruder. The statue moved. A gauntlet cracked the decree, word by holy word, until time snapped back and the sentence died unfinished. Bolt of thunder would have been noise here, so the shotgun became punctuation. The Emperor parried pellets as if they were ideas, but one blast tore a shoulder guard free, Auramite cartwheeling in a glittering arc. Surprise flickered across the god's face, less at the damage than at the fact of it. The Slayer pressed, stamping through a reliquary, bones and rubrics bursting under heel. A roar rolled down from unseen vaults. Reactor choirs straining, the throne drinking deeper from its saints. The Emperor surged, cloak of radiance snapping like a banner caught in a gale. His sword traced an ellipse the loop, enclosed the Slayer, walls of light contracting to a crushing knot. The crucible answered with a downward cleave that refused containment. The knot ripped the loop, failed, the two were again a meter apart, breathing like furnaces. Words came at last, layered, sovereign. Turn back. For 10,000 years, that tone had ended wars. The Slayer returned the only grammar he recognized. A dash forward, a feint left, a boot to the dais step, then the relentless cadence of a fighter who has learned the shape of gods by breaking them. The Emperor adapted. He flowed from duelist to general to storm, striking at angles that should not exist, wielding faith as physics. Golden wards erupted across the floor, each sigil promising paralysis. The Slayer used them as stepping stones, crossing sanctity as if it were rubble. A backhand from the god split his visor's reflection into starbursts. The man behind never blinked. Demons watched from the walk's eaves, mouths shut, remembering. Librarians listening via scrying pools wept without knowing why. Somewhere, a high lord tried to speak and produced only a tremor. Then the Emperor overreached. A two-handed cut meant to end epochs sheared a pillar, shattering a fresco of the triumph at Ulanor into a storm of saints. In the gap, the Slayer entered. The super shotgun roared inside the god's guard, the crucible carved a diagonal truth across Auramite and light. The Emperor staggered, brilliance dimming a fraction, surprise becoming certainty. This opponent would not tire, would not kneel, would not be negotiated. Silence bellowed between heartbeats. They reset, one radiant, one relentless, both already moving when the echo arrived. The second exchange would break the world. Terror braced for the impact. The first shockwave tore across terror like the strike of a god's hammer. The duel reverberated outward, each collision of crucible and golden blade echoing as seismic convulsions. Mountains split down their spines, peaks collapsing into avalanches that consumed valleys and cities. Oceans surged as tsunamis, waves rising high enough to swallow coasts in minutes. The ground groaned, cracked, and bled molten fire where their blows landed. Terror itself, the cradle of humanity, was breaking. Within the imperial palace, sanctuaries collapsed like sandcastles. Marble columns splintered, frescoes of saints turned to dust, and reliquaries shattered into glittering fragments. The Emperor's Hall, once a shrine of glory, became a furnace of ruin. Custodian corpses already littering the steps were vaporized by stray blasts, their sacrifice erased in the storm. Outside, cities disintegrated under invisible hands. Hive towers toppled like trees in a storm, their upper spires snapping as shockwaves rippled through foundations. Billions screamed, but most never heard their own voices. The pressure crushed lungs, shattered glass, and turned steel into ribbons. Streets folded, bridges snapped. Cathedrals sank into their own shadows. The siege of terror was no longer a war, it was an apocalypse. Psychers across the galaxy felt the duel and paid its price. Choirs aboard black ships burst into flames, burning alive as their minds fractured. Astropaths screamed until their skulls split, transmitting visions of green and gold clashing beyond comprehension. Across 1,000 sectors, psychic lights winked out, leaving silence and terror. The warp churned, the immaterium bending in shock, demons cackling and wailing as the storm tore even their realms. The Astronomicon guttered like a dying flame. Navigators, lifelines of the Imperium's fleets, watched in horror as their beacon faltered. Warp routes collapsed into darkness, ships stranded in interstellar seas with no stars to guide them. Admirals panicked as orders dissolved into chaos. To many, it seemed not merely terror, but the Imperium itself was unraveling. Billions more perished without ever glimpsing the duel itself. On the far side of the planet, children starved in collapsed hablocks, oceans swallowed continents, and fires raged unchecked across forests long forgotten. The battle between two figures at the palace consumed more lives than entire crusades. Faith, the Imperium's last defense, wavered as pilgrims screamed that Judgment Day had come. Inside the palace, the clash exceeded mortal comprehension. Every strike distorted reality. The crucible's red edge tore open cracks in dimensions, glimpses of hell spilling through before being burned away by golden fire. The Emperor's sword wrote laws into being, laws that crumbled when the Slayer's advance refused to recognize them. Statues of saints crumbled as if ashamed. Time faltered, stretching then snapping, minutes folding upon themselves like brittle parchment. The High Lords huddled in bunkers, listening to the screams outside. Some prayed, others clawed at each other, blaming, threatening, begging for ships that would never come. Even they realized that their power was meaningless in the shadow of this confrontation. Still, neither warrior faltered. The Emperor burned brighter, pouring centuries of psychic might into each swing, his voice echoing across the warp, declaring humanity would not be broken. The Slayer answered with unrelenting advance, each strike the same refusal he had carried into hell itself. Neither wavered, neither yielded. To witnesses, it ceased to be combat and became the end of the world. Some whispered that it was no longer terror-breaking, but reality itself. And as the dust and fire consumed all, one question drowned the Imperium's prayers, its riots, its despair: would terror itself survive? The outcome remained shrouded in suspense. The storm raged on. The throne room was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield where gods broke. The Emperor rose fully from the throne, his skeletal frame blazing with radiance brighter than the sun. His voice thundered across the warp, reaching psychers on distant worlds who wept blood as they heard his words. By my will, humanity endures. The declaration rippled across the galaxy, a roar of defiance from a god refusing to yield. His body burned with golden fire, his aura swelling until the chamber was drowned in daylight. Statues dissolved, walls liquefied into molten slag, and marble shattered into dust beneath the pressure of his will. Outside, the sky of terror became flame, auroras of psychic energy painting the heavens in hues no human eye was meant to see. For a fleeting instant, hope returned. If any being could stand against this storm, it was the Emperor of mankind. The Doomslayer walked through the fire. His armor blackened, plates cracked, yet his stride never faltered. Bolts of psychic lightning tore gouges in the ground, rivers of fire swallowed entire halls, and time itself trembled beneath the Emperor's command. The Slayer pressed forward, gauntlets raised, weapons roaring. Each blast of his shotgun, each swing of the crucible, cut through brilliance as though cleaving mist. Faith, fire, and fury broke against him, and still he came. The Emperor's blade became an eclipse of light, arcs carving scripture into the air. Each strike was meant to end him, each thrust a universe's worth of judgment. The Slayer met them not with parries or finesse, but with momentum that cared nothing for artistry. Blades clashed, sparks became novas, the chamber rang with collisions that shook continents. Across the Imperium, psychers convulsed. Millions cried out as their god's pain bled through them. Entire choirs died in fire, their bodies igniting as the Emperor strained against the predator before him. Even the chaos gods paused. Their laughter died into silence, watching as the god who had defied them for 10,000 years fought a mortal who could not be bent. The Emperor unleashed his full might. His body dissolved into pure light, a form no longer flesh but divinity. His words became thunderclaps, his gestures supernova. Every ounce of his essence poured into this single duel, knowing that humanity's fate rested upon it. He was no longer merely a man upon a throne, but the son of terror itself. The Slayer entered the heart of that star. His visor glowed red, reflecting the storm as his crucible flared. He waded through radiance as if through shallow water, each step crushing prayers into silence. He swung once, and the blade of crimson fire struck the Emperor's form. Golden light cracked, a ripple surged across the warp, and psychers screamed as though they had been impaled themselves. The Emperor staggered. For the first time in 10 millennia, divinity faltered. His blade rose again, arcs of blinding fury lashing outward, tearing reality into ribbons. The Slayer was already moving, closing the gap, shotgun bucking in deafening thunder, blade driving forward. They collided in a storm that split heavens and hells alike. The Emperor struck with desperation, each blow burning brighter, faster, sharper. His voice roared across terror. Humanity will not fall. But his body betrayed him. The cracks deepened, the light flickered. His strength, though infinite in spirit, was finite in form. Against an ocean of rage without end, brilliance waned. The Slayer's fist shattered his guard. The crucible tore through his golden fire, burning deeper, cutting truth into the god of mankind. A sound rose, not from the Emperor, but from the galaxy itself. Astropaths shrieked as blood frothed in their lungs. Pilgrims collapsed mid-prayer. On worlds far from terror, children cried without knowing why. The Emperor trembled. For the first time, humanity's god was not unyielding. His form wavered, his fire dimmed, his voice faltered. The Doomslayer loomed, unstoppable, inevitable, his silence heavier than any curse. The blade sank deeper, and the Emperor, guardian of 10,000 years, felt mortality pierce divinity. The duel was not finished, but the truth was undeniable. Inevitability had come. The Emperor was beginning to fall. The throne room burned. Walls once carved with saints were rubble. Golden statues shattered. Marble floors split into jagged trenches. The Emperor stood in the ruin, light flickering from his body like a faltering star. His breath, if it could still be called such, echoed as thunder across the hall. His sword, once radiant as a sunrise, now shook faintly in his grasp, its brilliance dulled by exhaustion. And still he fought. With the desperation of a god who had borne the weight of humanity for 10,000 years, the Emperor lashed out. His blade split the air in arcs of lightning, each strike powerful enough to collapse mountains. Psychic fire surged upward, tearing the ceiling into fragments that rained down like meteors. His voice bellowed, "Humanity will endure." The cry carried through the warp, a final command to his species. But endurance meant nothing to the Slayer. Through fire, through lightning, through faith itself, he advanced. His armor was blackened, scarred, glowing with heat, yet his pace did not falter. He raised no banners, made no vow, spoke no word. His silence was more final than the Emperor's roar. Every step he took shattered the ground, closing the space between them. The Emperor struck again. His blade carved symbols into reality, each a law older than memory. Time bent under his will, trying to cage the intruder. The Slayer shattered Ro's laws with brute force, his fists breaking truths written since the dawn of mankind. He swung the crucible, its crimson edge cleaving through psychic storms. Where faith wrote scripture, rage wrote verdict. The Emperor stumbled. His fire guttered, his blade wavered. For the first time, his body showed not defiance but fatigue. The god who had never bent, never faltered, trembled before a mortal who knew no end. Across the galaxy, psychers screamed in unison, their connection to his will breaking. Choirs fell silent. The Astronomicon's beacon dimmed, flickering like a candle in the wind. The Slayer surged forward. One shotgun blast thundered, shattering the Emperor's guard. The golden blade fell from his hand, ringing against the cracked stone. The crucible rose high, its edge burning with unnatural crimson fire. The Emperor raised his hand in defiance, but his light no longer answered. The blade descended. It tore through golden fire, through psychic brilliance, through the godhood of mankind. The sound that followed was not of steel on flesh, but of galaxies screaming. The Emperor's body convulsed, light exploding outward in a shockwave that engulfed the palace, then terror itself. Mountains cracked, oceans boiled. Entire hive cities collapsed into ash. Across the stars, the Astronomicon extinguished, plunging humanity's fleets into darkness. Navigators clawed at their faces in despair as the beacon that had guided them for millennia went out forever. Silence followed. The Emperor collapsed, his radiant form dimming to the shell of a broken man. The golden throne cracked beneath him, cables snapping, machinery shrieking in despair. The god of humanity who had borne their faith and their destiny lay ruined. No chorus sang. No army cheered. No prayer could fill the void. The Slayer stood over him, visor reflecting the corpse of a god. He did not kneel, did not speak, did not claim victory. He simply turned, his presence heavier than the silence that followed. He walked forward through the ruin, leaving behind the shattered throne and the broken body of a god who had held the galaxy together for 10,000 years. For the Imperium, there was no triumph, only disbelief. The Emperor was dead, and the galaxy trembled, knowing nothing could replace him. The throne no longer glowed. Where once the Emperor's radiance had poured across the galaxy, guiding fleets, sustaining faith, and binding an empire, there was only ruin. The golden throne stood cracked, its machinery sparking weakly, its once immortal occupant broken. The chamber that had been the heart of humanity was now a tomb. Terra fell silent. The Adeptus Custards, who had stood undefeated for 10,000 years, dropped to their knees. They did not weep, they could not. But their silence, their stillness, was louder than any lament. To see their god broken was to feel eternity itself collapse. They had no prayers, no vows left, only disbelief. Priests screamed in terror. Some tore their robes, clawing their own faces, unable to accept what their eyes told them. Others raised their voices higher, howling that the emperor had ascended, that his death was not death but transformation. Yet their cries sounded hollow, desperate echoes in a world stripped of its god. Across the galaxy, psychers burned out like candles in a storm. Astropaths burst into flame mid-transmission, their screams cut short as the last traces of the Astronomicon winked out. The beacon that had guided humanity's fleets for millennia was gone. In its absence, ships drifted blind, empires fractured, and worlds realized with sudden horror that they were alone. The Imperium began to fracture instantly. The High Lords fell into chaos, their council erupting in violence as accusations and denials flew. Fleets prepared to splinter, commanders declaring themselves guardians of humanity's last hope. Without the throne, without the light, without faith, the great colossus of the Imperium was breaking apart at its core. And through it all, the Slayer stood silent. He did not raise his arms in victory. He did not carve his name into history, did not sit upon the throne, did not claim dominion. He simply turned, boots echoing across the broken stone. His silhouette faded into smoke and shadow, leaving behind the corpse of a god. For him, this was not conquest. This was not destiny. It was only another war, another battle in a chain of endless fury. Where the Imperium had seen a god, he had seen only another foe to be broken. And now that it was done, he left without a word, without a claim, without a crown. The galaxy trembled. Billions fell to their knees, unsure whether to pray or curse. Some cried that humanity was damned. Others whispered that perhaps they had been freed. But none could ignore the emptiness that now filled the stars. The silence left in the Emperor's absence was heavier than any roar of victory. Chaos laughed. The gods exulted, yet even their triumph was edged with unease. For the Slayer had not joined them, had not sworn allegiance. He had slain their greatest enemy, but he remained their predator. Their laughter faltered, replaced by whispers of dread. On Terra, fires burned unchecked. The palace was a ruin, its sanctity shattered. Pilgrims wailed in the streets, clutching icons that no longer carried meaning. The greatest fortress of humanity had not simply fallen, it had been made irrelevant, its core hollowed. And in the warp, a new silence spread. Where once the Emperor's will had pressed back the tides, now there was only absence. The gods surged forward, their legions pouring across new paths, their laughter echoing. But woven through that triumph was fear, fear of the one who had wrought this silence. The Doomslayer remained, not as ruler, not as god, not as a savior. He was only the storm that had passed, leaving ruin in his wake, with no promise of return and no hint of departure. Humanity knelt in grief, in disbelief, in despair. Their god was gone. Their beacon was extinguished. Their empire was crumbling. And still, the Slayer walked onward. The moment the Emperor fell, the galaxy went blind. The Astronomicon, that psychic lighthouse which had burned without pause for 10,000 years, flickered once and then died. Its collapse was felt instantly. Across the void, navigators screamed as their third eyes dissolved into blackness. Fleets drifting in the Immaterium lost their bearings, thrown adrift into seas of madness. Some ships vanished without trace, swallowed whole by demons before their crew could even scream. Others tore themselves apart in blind desperation, firing engines until their hulls cracked, breaking apart like shattered bones. For millennia, the Imperium had survived because of that single light. With it gone, the stars themselves seemed to darken. Whole sectors went silent in a heartbeat, cut off from Terra, cut off from each other. 1,000 worlds blinked into isolation, their people suddenly realizing that no help would ever come again. Panic swept through the void like wildfire. On Terra, the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Pilgrims who had devoted their lives to feeling the Emperor's presence collapsed in hysteria. Some clawed out their own eyes, declaring that the galaxy had been plunged into eternal night. Priests filled cathedrals with shrieks of denial, their sermons breaking into madness as the realization spread. The Gade Emperor was gone, and with him the foundation of their faith. The custodians stood silent, golden statues of disbelief, unable to move or speak in the absence of their lord. On distant worlds, the shock was even worse. Ships in my journey were hurled into the warp, their crews torn apart by demons freed from the leash of the Emperor's psychic shield. Entire convoys, carrying food, weapons, medicine, vanished in moments, their absence condemning billions to famine and collapse. Hive cities, once dependent on endless supply chains, became cages of starvation within weeks. Feudal lords rose from the ashes, carving empires from isolated systems. The dream of unity crumbled like glass dropped upon stone. Admirals, stranded at the edge of the void, turned to madness. Some declared themselves emperors in their own right, crowning themselves rulers of fragments of fleets. Others ordered their crews to pray harder, demanding faith to relight the beacon. The prayers went unanswered. Riots followed, crewmen tearing each other apart as discipline rotted. The warp itself surged with laughter. Demons poured into routes once closed, hunting the blind fleets. Worlds cut off from aid collapsed into civil war as rival factions sought to seize control. The Inquisition issued desperate decrees, demanding order, demanding faith, but without the Emperor's presence, their words had no weight. Witch burnings and purges erupted in panic, but the flames could not restore a light that had truly gone out. On Terra, the High Lords of the Imperium gathered in their chambers, paralyzed. Some shouted for denial, claiming the Astronomicon was only dimmed. Others argued for immediate martial law. A few whispered the truth in broken voices. The Imperium as it had been was over. 10,000 years of continuity had been severed in an instant. The core had crumbled and the Colossus was falling. And still, the Slayer did not speak. He had no interest in the throne, no claim upon the ruins of an empire. He walked away from the ashes of the Golden Throne as if it were nothing more than another battlefield. The galaxy shook around him, but he remained the silent storm, the cause, not the claimant. To the common man, the loss was beyond comprehension. Where once they had trusted in the Emperor's light, they now saw only endless darkness. Entire generations raised to believe in his divinity suddenly found themselves abandoned. Some despaired and ended their lives. Others rioted, demanding new gods. Many turned to chaos, filling the vacuum with worship of darker powers. And some few, scattered and broken, whispered that perhaps the Slayer was the new god, a god of silence, fury, and ruin. The Astronomicon was gone. The beacon that had held humanity together was extinguished, and for the first time since the dawn of the Imperium, the galaxy was truly dark. The Senatorum Imperialis had endured for 10,000 years as the echo of the Emperor's will. Within its chambers, beneath vaulted ceilings carved with saints, the High Lords of Terra had ruled in his name. Now those halls reeked of fear. The throne was silent. The Astronomicon was extinguished. The Emperor was gone. Chaos filled the void. Some lords raved in denial, pounding fists against marble tables, insisting that the Emperor still lived, that his fall was only an illusion. Others whispered desperately of ascension, claiming he had become something greater beyond mortal comprehension. But behind the shouts and prayers lurked ambition. A few saw opportunity, a throne empty, a power vacuum unlike any since the heresy. Eyes that once trembled beneath the Emperor's gaze now glittered with hunger. Arguments became accusations. Accusations became daggers. Within hours of the Emperor's death, assassinations echoed through the corridors of power. Arbites dragged corpses from the council chamber, their blood still steaming on stone. Servitors carried out headless remains of lords whose voices had fallen silent in sudden debate. The Adeptus Custodes, once guardians of the throne and its rulers, stood like statues at the chamber's edge. Their purpose had been to protect the Emperor. With his death, their oaths turned to ash. They did not interfere in the slaughter. They did not defend the lords. They stood, golden but hollow, silent witnesses to the decay of mankind's supposed leadership. Outside, terror burned. Pilgrims rioted in streets demanding answers. Billions turned on priests whose sermons had promised eternal divinity. Voxcasters screamed contradictory proclamations that the Emperor lived, that he was dead, that a new savior had come, that the end of the world had arrived. Fire consumed whole districts of the hive cities as mobs tore shrines apart in grief and rage. Inside the council chambers, the ecclesiarchy split apart. Half of its priests declared the Slayer a demon, the final test of faith sent by chaos to destroy mankind. Others whispered the unthinkable, that he was a new god, greater even than the Emperor, a storm to be worshipped instead of feared. These whispers spread like wildfire, creating sects within hours, priests turning on one another as holy books were torn and rewritten by bloodied hands. The Mechanicus retreated into secrecy, locking their archives and vaults, muttering of forbidden technologies and ancient protocols. To them, the death of the Emperor meant the death of the Omnissiah, the machine god made flesh. Some magi declared themselves free of old faiths and began constructing empires of logic and steel. Others fell into despair, declaring their forges cursed. The unity that had bound Mars to Terra fractured instantly. By the third day, the Senatorum had become a killing floor. The lords no longer argued, they barricaded themselves in wings of the palace, each issuing contradictory edicts in the emperor's name. Armies loyal to different factions clashed in the corridors. Bombs detonated beneath frescoes of saints. Terra's heart, once a beacon of order, now pulsed with civil war. And in the midst of it all lay the throne room, sealed in silence. The corpse of the emperor remained untouched, the shattered throne a tomb no one dared to approach. The custards kept vigil there, their golden armor dim in the half-light, their purpose broken. They neither obeyed nor defied the high lords. They simply stood, guardians without a master. The Imperium's heart had rotted. No decree reached the galaxy. No command unified fleets or worlds. Terra was no longer the beacon of mankind but a corpse world, echoing with fear and betrayal. The halls where humanity had been ruled for 10,000 years became mausoleums of ambition and paranoia. The High Lords are no longer governed. They clutch daggers and prayers, waiting for the galaxy to devour itself. The death of the Emperor did not end the Imperium in a single moment. It broke apart like glass, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Each shard reflected some memory of what had been, but none carried the whole. Sector governors, once vassals of Terra, declared independence. Their proclamations echoed from palace balconies and vox castas, new empires, new dynasties, all crowned in the name of survival. Some claimed they were the true heirs of the Emperor. Others admitted openly that Terra had fallen and that they would chart their own course. None possessed the strength to bind more than a handful of systems. The Astartes retreated. Proud chapters that had once been the mailed fist of the Imperium recalled their warriors to their homeworlds. Fortress monasteries sealed their gates, banners withdrawn. They had been bred to serve the Emperor, to die in his wars, to protect his realm. Without him, their oaths trembled. Some declared neutrality, retreating to become guardians of a single planet. Others named themselves kings, carving dominions of steel and gene-forged warriors. Rivalries, long hidden, now burst into open war as brother fought brother across the stars. The Imperial Guard collapsed into fragments. Whole regiments, once loyal unto death, mutinied when orders no longer arrived. Commanders crowned themselves warlords, armies turning into marauding bands that looted worlds they had once sworn to defend. Some swore fealty to ambitious high lords who still claimed the Emperor's legacy. Others descended into pure anarchy, fleets of warships reduced to pirate flotillas. The hammer of the Imperium had become a storm of fractured blades. Chaos surged into the void. Without the Astronomy Khan's light to hold them back, cults rose across the Imperium, promising salvation to the gods of the warp. Demons spilled into systems once shielded by the Emperor's will. Despair made converts faster than faith ever had. Where once the Emperor's image had ruled, altars now bled in the names of Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tezin-Che. In 1,000 worlds, the fall of the Emperor was retold not as tragedy, but as vindication. Humanity's god had died, and the gods of chaos lived. Xeno's empires pressed their advantage. Eldar raiding fleets carved bloody paths through undefended sectors. Orc wargs surged unchecked, feeding on the weakness, tearing worlds apart for sport. Necron tomb worlds stirred, their ancient kings awakening to find their prey more fractured than ever. Even the Tyranids, sensing weakness across the galactic web, drove tendrils deeper, stripping systems of life without resistance. The walls had fallen, and predators of every kind rushed through the breach. Everywhere, humanity clung to survival in fragments. A single hive world might declare itself the new Imperium, banners raised above starving millions. A fleet commander might seize 6 systems, declaring his ship the new throne. Ecclesiarchs tore themselves into sects, each crowning a new god or heresy, each claiming legitimacy. The dream of unity became a parody of itself, thousands of false emperors ruling tiny empires that could not endure. the galaxy became a mosaic of fiefdoms. Some tried to hold fast to the old laws, others abandoned them entirely. Some whispered that the Doomslayer was the true god now, the slayer of divinity itself. Others cursed his name, seeing him as the herald of humanity's doom. But whether worshipped or cursed, his silence echoed louder than any sermon. He did not stay to rule. He left the galaxy to fracture, untouched, unhealed. The Imperium was no longer an empire. It was a shattered reflection of what it had been, a broken mirror of faith, war, and ruin. Each shard glittered in isolation, doomed to fade, unable to rejoin the whole. And as the galaxy bled, one question haunted the survivors. Who, if anyone, could unite mankind again? The galaxy screamed as the Emperor's light vanished. For 10,000 years, his psychic presence had held back the tides of the Immaterium. With his death, the dam collapsed. The warp poured forth in a flood of madness, its tides surging through every wound in reality. Demonic incursions erupted like wildfires, each one consuming worlds that had once been shielded by faith and light. On 100 planets, skies split open, disgorging hosts of Khorne. Bloodthirsters strode across ruined cathedrals, their axes wet with the blood of millions. The ground shook beneath their fury as rivers ran crimson, cities turned into arenas of slaughter. Imperial Guard regiments, already fractured and leaderless, broke before the storm, their lasguns impotent against gods of rage. Where once commissars had held the line with faith, now they died screaming as their men fled into the jaws of demons. Other worlds drowned, not in blood but in rot. Nurgle's plague hosts spread like wildfire, the stench of decay rolling across continents. Cities fell silent as bells of pestilence rang through poisoned winds. Entire populations swelled, burst, and rose again as walking husks of disease. The laughter of the plague god echoed across one-sprowed hives, their spires collapsing under the weight of pus and ruin. Whole sectors vanished into filth, quarantined only by the silence of death. Tezienchi's sorcery tore reality itself apart. On worlds already cracking under psychic strain, the sky melted into impossible hues, time folded in on itself, and flesh turned into glass or flame. Sorcerer kings rose overnight, ruling fragments of humanity that had bartered souls for survival. Demonic hosts of shifting colors poured across the stars, their whispers promising salvation even as they rewrote reality into labyrinths of despair. And in the darkest reaches of void, Slaaneish's legions swept across defenseless worlds. Pleasure and agony blurred until entire populations screamed themselves into oblivion. Palaces of excess rose overnight, only to collapse into ash when satiation turned to boredom. Humanity's collapse birthed ecstasies and agonies that fed the dark prince beyond measure. Chaos fleets surged through the galaxy, devouring isolated systems. Without the Astronomicon, no reinforcements came. No unified counterstrike arrived. The Imperium's fragmented remnants fought blindly, each alone, each consumed in turn. Worlds that had once stood proud beneath the Emperor's light became feeding grounds for the gods of the warp. And yet, amidst their triumph, unease grew. Whispers spread even among demons, whispers of a figure moving within the warp itself. Bloodletters spoke of a hunter who carved through their packs with silence and fury. Plague-bearers moaned of a predator immune to rot. Sorcerous demons glimpsed visions of a green figure tearing through their labyrinths, breaking enchantments by brute force alone. Even the keepers of secrets, exulting in their harvest, flinched when shadows in the Immaterium trembled with footsteps they could not name. The Chaos Gods exulted. They roared in triumph as humanity bled, as the Imperium collapsed into fractal ruin. They feasted on despair, slaughter, and madness as never before. Yet behind their laughter lay caution, for they knew the Doomslayer. He was no servant, no champion, no pawn. He had cut through hell before, and now hell's cousins in the warp felt his breath at their necks. Where mortals saw him as executioner, the gods saw him as predator. He could not be bargained with, he could not be tempted. And though they now reigned supreme, they knew that supremacy was fragile so long as he walked. So chaos celebrated, but their revelry was edged with dread. Their greatest feast had come, but so too had their greatest hunter. The warp was unleashed. Humanity was drowning. And somewhere in the storm, the Slayer moved. The Immaterium thundered with celebration. The corpse god was gone, his beacon extinguished, his Imperium collapsing into shards. Never in 10,000 years had chaos triumphed so completely. Demons sang, legions danced in blood and fire, and the four thrones of damnation glowed brighter than ever. Yet even as they roared, the gods remembered him. Khorne, Lord of Skulls, bellowed with triumph as rivers of gore overflowed. Worlds burned as offerings to his insatiable rage. Yet deep within his brass citadel, a flicker of unease stirred. He recalled the Slayer, the mortal who had cut through Hell's armies with silence and fury, who had torn champions limb from limb without once bowing to rage. Khorne knew slaughter, but he also knew predators. And the Doomslayer was no servant of bloodlust. He was its executioner. The thought gnawed at even the blood god, a killer who killed gods, but never worshipped them. Tizine reveled in the unraveling of order. Threads of fate curled and tangled into new labyrinths, a tapestry of collapse that stretched across the stars. His laughter echoed as he rewove destiny shattered by the Emperor's death. Yet in the skeins of possibility he saw a shadow he could not bind. Every scheme ended the same. A green figure stepping through his webs as though they were smoke. For a being who thrived on control and inevitability, the Slayer was a void, a blank note in the song of fate. And Tizine, for all his knowledge, hated blanks most of all. Nurgle bloom in delight. His garden overflowed, vines of pestilence curling into new systems as rot spread unchecked. He cradled humanity's despair like a gift, each cough and plague another seed for his joy. Yet even he remembered the Slayer. He had seen the mortal carve through pestilence without pause, his fury burning through decay as if rot itself recoiled from him. What is disease to a being who does not rest, who does not falter, who cannot be softened by time? Nurgle chuckled through his flies, but beneath the mirth was dread. For there is no infection in rage that never yields. Slaanesh feasted. The fall of faith, the collapse of hope, the ecstasies of despair, all were ambrosia. Their halls pulsed with screams of pleasure and agony entwined, humanity's ruin feeding the Dark Prince beyond imagining. Yet when Slaanesh turned senses toward the Slayer, they tasted nothing. No indulgence, no corruption, no crack through which desire might seep. The void within him was unyielding, colder than any denial. It was not asceticism, nor resistance, it was simply absence. A hunger that consumed, but could never be consumed. Even for Slaanesh, that emptiness was terrifying. So the gods rejoiced, but their joy was poisoned. The Emperor had fallen. Humanity was in ruins. The warp overflowed with conquest. And yet, the one who had delivered this greatest of victories was not theirs. He did not kneel at their thrones, did not wear their marks, did not crave their gifts. He walked outside their dominion, a predator of their kind, hunting without prayer, without allegiance, without end. For the first time in their existence, the pantheon of chaos felt fear not of another god, but of a mortal who had slaughtered hell itself, a mortal who now walked their immaterium without bowing. Their triumph was shadowed, their feast soured. The galaxy lay at their feet, yet above it all loomed silence, the silence of the Doomslayer still walking. The galaxy spun into delirium. With the Emperor's light extinguished, the warp bled freely into real space. The boundaries between nightmare and waking life collapsed. Demons walked in daylight, no longer restrained by shrines or wards, their laughter echoing across continents. Possessions multiplied until entire cities became puppets, their citizens shrieking with alien voices. Inquisitors, once the hunters of corruption, were themselves hunted and devoured, their authority stripped of meaning. Humanity drowned in its own nightmares, each world collapsing into madness. Planets erupted in rebellion. Long-suppressed heresies rose openly, declaring allegiance to the gods of chaos. Cults once hidden in shadows now marched through the streets, carrying banners of blood and fire. Imperial Guard regiments, fractured and abandoned, turned their guns upon their own worlds. The corpse of the Imperium rotted from within, every layer of its society peeling away under the pressure of despair. Xeno's predators pressed into the void, their advance unchecked. The orcs roared in savage delight, Warhag. Banners carried across sectors as humanity's defenses crumbled. They turned collapsing Imperial bastions into arenas of endless slaughter, their joy in battle amplified by the sheer chaos. The Eldar despaired, their fragile threads of fate unraveling as humanity, once a bulwark in the galactic balance, collapsed into ruin. Even their seers fell silent. Visions drowned by the tides of madness. Tyrannid hive fleets feasted without resistance. stripping worlds bare before moving on to the next. The galaxy had become a banquet and humanity its main course. Everywhere, there was only war. Systems once bound by faith and bureaucracy became carnival grounds for endless slaughter. A planet might declare itself holy one day, only to be a demon world the next. Fleets that once bore the Aquila now drifted under pirate kings, their banners soaked in blood. The age of the Imperium was over, replaced by an age of fracture where no law, no beacon, and no god remained. And yet, through the storm, stories spread. They began as whispers among survivors. Soldiers who had lived through impossible battles spoke of a figure in green armor who tore demons apart with his bare hands. Refugees claimed to have seen him stride through burning hives, silent and unstoppable, leaving only corpses in his wake. Cultists screamed his name in terror when their rituals failed, their sacrifices ending not in exaltation but in slaughter. Even among the gods' legions, rumors circulated that the Slayer stalked the warp, striking down bloodthirsters, tearing through sorcerous fortresses, and leaving trails of ICR realities. The Doomslayer became a myth within the madness. To mortals, he was a nightmare they prayed to avoid or a savior they dared not invoke. To demons, he was a predator who could not be contained. To the gods themselves, he was an anomaly, the one storm that could not be charted. But he was no savior. He did not rally fleets, did not rebuild thrones, did not crown himself lord. Where he walked, there was only ruin. He slaughtered demons, crushed cults, and burned champions, but he offered no hand to rebuild. He was not salvation. He was silence and death, a storm passing through the ruins of empires. Humanity whispered in despair. Was he deliverer or destroyer? Could a being who slew gods also protect men? Or was his presence only another chapter in their damnation, another storm to endure? No answer came. He gave no command, no sermon, no sign. He only walked. And the galaxy drowned behind him, spinning deeper into chaos, torn between destruction and myth. In the void left by the Emperor's death, silence reigned. But silence does not last in the galaxy. It becomes filled with stories. On shattered hive worlds, survivors whispered of a figure who had walked through fire and torn the Emperor from his throne. Some spoke in terror, their voices hushed, claiming he was the herald of humanity's damnation. Others spoke in reverence, eyes alight, insisting he was deliverance itself, the one who had proved that even gods could die. These stories spread faster than any fleet, carried on vox echoes, on refugees' tongues, and on the desperate hopes of billions. Shrines began to appear. On some worlds they were crude, broken chains arranged in circles, painted green with scavenged pigment. On others, they rose as cathedrals of silence, halls built without altars, where no prayers were spoken, only the sound of boots echoing endlessly. Pilgrims walked into starless voids, chartless and blind without the Astronomicon, seeking the storm that now stalked the galaxy. Few ever found him. Those who did discover that the Slayer answered no prayers. For some, he was salvation. To see him descend into a world overrun by demons was to witness the apocalypse inverted. Where warpspawn howled, he was silent. Where cults chanted, he was interruption. Where chaos triumphed, he was in denial. Survivors wept, believing themselves spared by a god of fury. They built temples in his absence, inscribing their walls not with words, but with scars made by chains and blades. For others, he was damned. His fury did not discriminate between cultist and soldier, between heretic and pilgrim. He tore apart regiments who mistook him for an ally, crushed cities that stood in his path, left ruins where people had sought only to worship. In their eyes, he was not a savior, but a destroyer, a god who punished faith itself with silence. Their prayers became curses, their hymns lamentations. The paradox only made his legend stronger. His refusal to claim dominion made him greater than any god the Imperium had ever known. He did not demand offerings. He did not ask for worship. He could not be bribed, tempted, or bargained with. And for that reason, he terrified more deeply than any divine tyrant. For mortals, there is always negotiation with gods, prayers for mercy, sacrifices for favor. With the Doomslayer, there was only inevitability. He answered nothing. Cults rose in his name, fractured and contradictory. One sect called him the Godbreaker, carving icons of shattered crowns and fallen thrones. Another named him the Eternal Judge, worshipping his silence as the highest law. A darker sect declared him the Beast of the End, prophesying that his coming was the final chapter of mankind's story. Each worshipped their myth, none worshipped the man, and the man himself ignored them all. When pilgrims found him, they discovered not a god of sermons, but a hunter of silence. Some wept in joy at the sight of his armor, only to die when they blocked his path. Others offered gifts, sacrifices, oaths, and were met with indifference. A few who clung too tightly were torn apart, their shrines smeared with their own blood. It was this indifference that terrified more than any blade. Gods punish, gods command, but the slayer did neither. He simply walked onward. His legend grew with every silence he left behind. Entire worlds reshaped their myths around him. Children grew up fearing that his shadow would fall upon their homes. Others prayed for it, desperate for deliverance from chaos. The galaxy, fractured and burning, now defined itself not by the Emperor's light, but by the storm that had replaced it. And in the quiet that followed his passing, the question spread, whispered in markets, cathedrals, and war councils alike: has the Doomslayer become a god? In the Immaterium, where demons had once feasted freely on humanity's ruin, new whispers spread like plague. Not of triumph, not of triumph, not of conquest, but of a hunter. The Doomslayer walked the warp. No ship carried him, no ritual summoned him. He appeared where the storm was thickest, where demons poured into real space unchecked, where the laughter of the gods was loudest. And wherever he appeared, the laughter died. On one world, bloodletters shrieked in exultation as they drowned cities in gore. Their triumph ended with silence, bodies scattered in heaps of crimson IQ, their skulls shattered beneath fists that did not falter. On another, the gardens of Nurgle spilled rot into hive towers until they burned. Plague-bearers wailed as the Slayer cut through them, their infections sliding harmlessly from his armor, their bloated carcasses reduced to sludge. Tzinchi's sorceries unraveled against him. Warpsmiths and sorcerers wove labyrinths of illusion, entire fortresses sculpted from impossible geometry. The Slayer tore through them with brute force, crushing walls that should not exist, breaking enchantments by walking through them as though they were mist. No trap held him, no scheme outpaced him. The great architect's creations cracked beneath hands that recognized no rules. Even Slaaneish's legions faltered, where they brought ecstasy and torment entwined. He answered with absence. Their whispers slid off his silence, their temptations shattered against his refusal. No lust, no agony, no desire found purchase. They struck with blades honed on mortal weakness, only to be torn apart by a force utterly immune to corruption. In his presence, their pleasures became screams, and their screams became silent. Demons began to dread the signs of his arrival. When the warp shook with thunder without storm clouds, they knew he was coming. When green light flickered where none should be, legions broke and fled. Even the mightiest champions, demon princes clad in the blessings of their gods, found themselves crushed beneath his fury. Their names, once eternal in the Immaterium, became footnotes in silence. Chaos incursions, once jubilant, turned hesitant. Demons still poured forth, but always they looked over their shoulders. For every great invasion risked drawing him. Every feast risked ending in slaughter. The galaxy burned, but the warp itself began to shiver at his tread. The gods took note. Khorne snarled that no warrior should fight without exalting bloodlust, and yet he could not deny that the Slayer's slaughter outpaced even his chosen champions. Tzinchi raged at the anomaly in his threads, a variable beyond foresight, a predator who cut through fate as though it were parchment. Nurgle muttered uneasily in his garden, vines recoiling at the thought of being immune to rot. Slaanesh, who had tasted every soul in creation, found only emptiness in him, an emptiness that devoured. For the first time, demons felt hunted. The warp, once a predator, had become prey. To mortals, his presence remained a myth, stories passed between refugees and soldiers, prayers whispered in broken shrines. But in the Immaterium, his reality was undeniable. He was no savior. He was no messiah. He was an executioner, stalking the heart of damnation itself. No pact could bind him. No corruption touched him. No death halted him. He was not the enemy of gods because he sought to replace them. He was their enemy because he existed outside them, a force that devoured their victories. Even in triumph, chaos trembled. The galaxy belonged to the gods, yet they knew. Wherever they reached too far, wherever they triumphed too openly, the Slayer would come. Not to save, not to rule, not to judge. Only to end. When the battles ended, when the last demon was torn apart and the last cultist silenced, the galaxy expected thunder. But what followed was only quiet. The Doomslayer vanished as suddenly as he had come. Fleets scoured the void, searching for green light upon abandoned battlefields, but they found only ruin. Planets he touched lay desolate, some strangely free of demonic corruption, others stripped so utterly of life that silence hung over empty cities like a tombstone. None knew which fate would follow his arrival, only that wherever he went, nothing remained unchanged. Whispers followed in his absence. Refugees claimed to have seen him walking alone across broken plains, never looking back. Soldiers told stories of watching him board derelict ships, vanishing into the void without a word. Some pilgrims swore he had passed among them, leaving no mark but the echo of footsteps. None could say where he went, nor why. He simply walked onward, as if the galaxy were only one more battlefield with no end. It was his silence that haunted most. The Imperium had been built upon proclamations, sermons, edicts, decrees that bound billions to faith. The Chaos Gods thrived on noise, on screams, on laughter, on endless cacophony. But the Slayer spoke nothing. He left no commandments, no promises, no threats. His silence was heavier than speeches, more final than prophecy. In it, survivors found despair or solace depending on what they needed most. Some declared that his refusal to speak was proof of his divine judgment. Others claimed it meant he was nothing more than a beast that could not reason. Yet the mystery only deepened his legend. On worlds he left behind, shrines rose not to celebrate, but to mark his passing. They bore no words, no icons, only the marks of his violence. Gouges cut into stone, scorched craters, shattered chains arranged in circles. Some worshipped these as holy relics, believing his silence was the highest truth. Others feared them, avoiding such places as cursed, haunted by the shadow of the storm. The question spread across the galaxy like a plague of its own. What drives him onward? Some said hatred, that he was a rage incarnate, a predator that could never rest until every demon was ash. Others whispered of penance, that he carried a burden none could fathom, a war eternal within his heart. A few dared suggest that he sought peace, though none could imagine such a thing for a figure who never stopped moving. No answer ever came. His silence left only speculation. Even demons, in their endless laughter and screams, trembled at the uncertainty, for they could endure war, but not mystery. And the Slayer's silence was mystery made flesh. So the galaxy burned around him, and he walked on. He did not rebuild. He did not command. He left empires to crumble, fleets to drift, worlds to rot or recover as they could. He cared nothing for victory or defeat. He hunted, and when the hunt was done, he vanished until the next storm called him forth again. In the void left by gods and emperors, the Doomslayer became the last myth. Not savior, not ruler, not conqueror. Only the storm that passed through, eternal and unknowable. The storm never rested, and the galaxy, fractured and trembling, prayed that it never turned its gaze upon them. The galaxy was no longer the galaxy humanity had known. Terra, cradle of mankind, smoldered as a ruin. Its hives were reduced to ash, its cathedrals toppled, the throne of the emperor nothing more than a tomb of broken gold. Where billions had once prayed in unison, silence now reigned, a silence too vast, too heavy to be filled by any sermon or proclamation. The corpse of the Imperium lay in fragments, its shards clawing at one another in desperation. Across the stars, chaos reigned. Governors crowned themselves kings of isolated sectors, each raising banners of legitimacy none recognized. Astarte's chapters, once paragons of loyalty, became warlords guarding only their fortress monasteries. The Imperial Guard, stripped of command, splintered into roving armies that fought as often against one another as against Xenos or demons. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, once united under the Omnissiah, fractured into forges ruled by rival dogmas. The Emperor's dream of unity had ended not in conquest, but in disintegration. Chaos surged in his absence. Demon worlds multiplied like sores across the galaxy, tides of the warp spilling unchecked. Every shrine of the Emperor became a battlefield, desecrated or consumed in blasphemous rites. The gods exulted, but uneasily. They reigned, yet they knew theirs was no unchallenged dominion. Their feast of souls, their triumph in humanity's fall, was shadowed by the knowledge of a predator still walking. Xeno's empires pressed in with merciless hunger. Orc wargs thundered across whole sectors, a tide of green destruction that no longer met unified resistance. Tyrannid hive fleets swarmed unchecked, stripping system of all life. Eldar wept in despair, their prophecies drowned beneath the tides of ruin. Necron dynasties awakened to a galaxy already broken, finding conquest easier than ever. Humanity had once been a bulwark, a shield, now it was a carrion, and every predator gathered to feed. And yet, amidst this ruin, stories persisted. They spread like wildfire, faster than ships, more enduring than fleets. Tales of a warrior who had slain the emperor himself, of a figure clad in green who walked alone through fire and silence. Survivors spoke of his fury, his silence, his inevitability. Some called him damnation, others salvation. A few dared whisper that he was not man, not God, but something older, rage made flesh, destined to walk until the stars themselves burned out. For the Imperium's fragments, these stories were both hope and terror. Hope, for if gods could die, perhaps humanity could rise again. Terror, for if even gods could fall, what chance did mortals have? Shrines rose in his name, but so too did curses. He was myth and blasphemy, worshipped and reviled in equal measure. Even chaos hesitated to revel fully. For all their triumph, their demons whispered uneasily of the predator who haunted their victories. They could not deny him. Their princes had fallen before him. Their hosts had burned in silence where he passed. And though humanity fractured, though terror burned, though the emperor himself was gone, the Doomslayer still walked. The galaxy was not saved. It was not destroyed. It existed in suspension, a nightmare without end, a wheel of war that would not stop turning. No throne ruled, no light guided, no unity bound. There was only conflict, eternal and ravenous. Yet one truth remained. As long as hell endured, so too did he. As long as demons clawed into reality, his fury would answer. His silence was the last certainty, the last myth, the last storm. The age of gods had ended. The emperor lay broken, chaos reigned, humanity fractured. But the Doomslayer remained, not as savior, not as conqueror, but as the eternal predator stalking the ruins of creation. The galaxy lay in ruin, and still, the storm walked. Generations passed, and the storm became a story. The Doomslayer, once a figure who had shattered gods and toppled empires, slipped into the realm of myth. His silence left no chronicles, no sermons, no proclamations. Only ruins remained where he had walked. Ruins and whispers that refused to die. And in the absence of certainty, legend grew. On fractured worlds, children were raised on songs of the figure in green. Some sang of him as savior, the one who had slain the false emperor and freed mankind from the tyranny of gods. Their lullabies spoke of liberation, of a storm that burned away corruption and cleared the stars for humanity to begin anew. Others told darker tales of a destroyer who had crushed their empire, murdered their god, and left them adrift in the abyss. To them, his name was cursed, his image a threat parents used to still unruly children. Be silent, or the Slayer will find you. Shrines dedicated to him endured in contradictory forms. Some built altars of broken chains and shattered crowns, honoring him as the Godbreaker. Others raised temples of silence where no words were spoken, only footsteps echoing through empty halls in reverence to his refusal to speak. In the wastes of terror itself, pilgrim cults gathered in the shadows of the ruined throne, declaring that his strike had not ended an age but begun a new one. Yet none of these sects ever saw him. None received his blessing or denial. They imagined him as God, as curse, as myth, and he gave them nothing. It was his silence that made the legend eternal. The emperor had preached, and his sermons became law. The gods of chaos shrieked, and their laughter became terror. But the Slayer spoke nothing. He neither claimed his victories nor explained his purpose, and in that void, mortals filled the silence with their own truths. To some, he was the final hope. To others, he was damned. To all, he was inevitable. Demons, too, remembered. Even as they reveled in humanity's collapse, their whispers carried fear. Bloodletters recoiled at green light in their visions, remembering the predator who had torn their kin apart. Plague-bearers moaned of a hunter immune to rot. Teasingch's demons spoke uneasily of a figure who walked through fate itself as though it were mist. Even Slonesh's choice trembled, for no temptation had ever touched him. For mortals, he was a myth. For demons, he was an eternal nightmare. The passage of time did not erode his image, it sharpened it. Without records, without boundaries, the Slayer's story became larger than truth. He was said to stride between stars on foot, to tear apart fleets with his bare hands, to silence entire worlds with a single blow. Every contradiction only strengthened the legend. He could not be measured, so he became immeasurable. And so the galaxy endured, fractured, burning, but never without his shadow. When wars erupted, his name returned. When demons surged, mortals prayed to or cursed him. When worlds fell silent, stories spread that he had passed through, leaving only ruins. His myth became less a story of the past than a promise for the future. Wherever war existed, so too did the Slayer. He was no longer a man. He was no longer God. He was inevitable. The storm that followed war. The silence that followed screams. The hunter that even gods could not escape. And as generations rose and fell, one truth remained. The legend outlasted the empire. The gods, the saints and the demons. The Doomslayer could not be killed. He could only endure. The galaxy burned. Worlds fractured into silence. Empires collapsed into dust, and faith lay in ruins. The emperor was gone. The imperium shattered. Chaos ascendant. Across the stars, Xenos feasted upon the corpse of mankind, and demons reveled in unending war. It should have been an ending, the close of humanity's story, the last echo of 10,000 years of empire. And yet, it was not. For somewhere in the smoke and ruin, the Doomslayer walked. No record could say where. Some swore they saw him upon demon worlds, carving through hordes until the walk itself recoiled. Others whispered he had vanished into the void, a shadow too vast to follow. His presence was a rumor, a myth sustained not by sight, but by silence. He was not emperor, not conqueror, not savior, and so he was never bound by the need for endings. Perhaps he battled still, lost within wars beyond mortal vision, tearing apart demons until the last scream of the last god. Perhaps he disappeared, his fury burned to ash, his silence the only legacy left to haunt the galaxy. No scripture, no prophecy, no seer could answer. The future of mankind might have been written in the stars, but the Slayer was never written. He was the page torn free, the word that refused to end. And that was what made him terrifying. For gods can die, empires can crumble, faith can burn away, but storms endure. They rise, they fall, they return. The Slayer was storm made flesh, and storms do not bow to history. They cannot be reasoned with, prayed to, or defeated. They pass, and in their passing, everything changes. The galaxy trembled, not knowing when or where he might strike again. Every demon incursion carried the fear that he might descend upon it. Every cult whispered his name in blasphemy and dread. Every fragment of humanity, whether clinging to false hope or cursing their fate, wondered if he would come, to destroy, to deliver, or to pass by without notice. There was no answer. There never would be, because the Slayer was not man, nor god, nor demon. He was inevitable, the silence that followed screams, the shadow that followed light. The hand that shattered crowns and crushed thrones. He could not be caged within narrative or prophecy, for his very existence defied ending. And so the tale closed not as a conclusion, but as a myth. The Doomslayer walked, or did not. He fought, or had vanished. He endured, or he ended. It did not matter. What mattered was the certainty that he could not be destroyed, only endured. His legend, whether flesh or echo, would stalk the galaxy as long as war existed. And in a galaxy of endless war, that meant forever. The final image was not of victory or defeat, but of silence. A lone figure in green armor, walking across an infinite horizon of fire and shadow. His fate unresolved, his path unknowable, his silence eternal. The galaxy burned, but the storm still walked.